Welcome, everybody. It's our great pleasure today to introduce Jim Stasheff, and he'll be telling us about homotopy coherence, theme, and variations.
Okay. No, this way. There we go. So homotopy coherence is a phrase that's comparatively recent, but by other names, it has a long and rich history. Now, this talk will be nonlinear because the concept has evolved nonlinear. Many parallel developments and some obvious connections are not obvious. So my main task today is to provide some insights and certainly not to prove any theorems. So I don't know if this is really a math talk. So it'll be semi-historical and quite idiosyncratic, with the topics determined by the knowledge and taste of the authors. Well, that refers to the paper that's almost finished. Actually, today, the idiosyncrasy will be entirely mine. But I think tying some of these topics together would be quite worthwhile. Now, why? Okay, so there's some of the topics I will be looking at. I said theme, and now there's some of the variations. This will not be the table of contents, so don't take the ordering from 1 to 6 to be terribly relevant. So a homotopy coherent diagram is a diagram from a catechol point of view, is a diagram of objects and morphisms, where the diagrams are no longer commutative, but they're replaced by explicit homotopies. And then those homotopies are to be coherently linked by higher homotopies, and so on. There's the rub. That hides a lot of structure. So, to our knowledge, the we refers to me and Tim Porter, unless otherwise. So to our knowledge, the first occurrence of homotopy coherence was without the name in 1957. Even 15 years later, the wording was still up to coherent homotopies. The earliest use of homotopy coherence we know of is due to Cordier. And indeed, I wouldn't have known it without Tim's participation. So for me, the concept was initiated by Masahiro Sugawara in 1957 in the context of topological H-spaces. The concept grew and developed names, and fairly recently it's been expressed with new vigor in relation to infinity structures of various sorts, including infinity local systems, which I will get to by the end of the talk. There's now even called a Journal of Higher Structures. So what started out back in 57 has really blossomed. So we'll start with an example of homotopy coherence, which is based on Sugawara's work. Oh, let's see if I can shrink this. So I assume you're not seeing. That's better. Up. So we all know that for base loops denoting composition by juxtaposition, the iterated product, one way is only homotopic to the other, and we can choose an explicit homotopy. But there's more going on. Those of you who know my work are not surprised. It's infinity structures. Sugawara obtained criteria for an H-space to be a homotopy associative H-space, or on even to when it was a loop space. When I was a graduate student in Princeton, and what was that? 50, 60 years ago, my supervisor, John Moore, suggested I look at the following problem. He had begun the study with Art Copeland. Question is, when a primitive cohomology class of a loop space was the suspension of a class in HM+1 of the space of which we're taking the loops. Suspension in this case is an accident of history. Normally, well, it does go from n to n+1, so I guess that's okay. In other words, when was an H map from Y into K pi n induced as the loops on a map to K pi n+1? That's right. So I attacked the problem. Somehow I discovered Sugawara's infinite sequence of conditions, higher homotopies, generalized that one we all know for the simple homotopy associativity. Now, Sugawara involved homotopy inverses as well. Fortunately, they could be avoided under mild restrictions on the setting in which we were working. Fortunately, because I don't think I could have made my way through to what I did without that ability. So to systematize specific higher homotopies, I introduced AN spaces and A infinity spaces. An AN space consists of a space together with a coherent set of maps where K sub K is the well-known K-2 dimensional associahedron, sometimes referred to as the Stasheff polytope, but I'll have more to disclaim about that later. Hopefully, many of you have seen these before. I was hoping to include the pictures, but the technology is eluding me. So, as we just saw, K3 is an interval. K4 is the pentagon, which shows up in many situations which do not proceed further. There are nice three-dimensional pictures of the case for K equals 5 and on from there. I originally presented it just as a finite cell complex, which was convex, but it wasn't really a polytope in the strict combinatorial geometric sense. There are now many graphic realizations of K5 in 3 dimensions, and even animated versions are now popular, and they occur in Stephen Forsey's zoo of relevant hedra, and there's the link. I would love to be able to go to it right now, but maybe after the talk is over. There's a lot more there relevant to some of the other structures we're going to see later. So the reason I say it shouldn't be called the Stasheff polytope, by the way, so-called is in quotes because for me, it has a negative connotation. For example, our previous so-called president. So it was more to the point, it was considered by Tamari back in 1951. Now, his point of view was quite different from mine, but it was very inspiring for other work, primarily in combinatorics, with not as much emphasis on the algebra. Anyway, there's this nice book which talks about associahedra, Tamari lattices, and all sorts of offspring. By the way, I tend to go too fast, so please interrupt me. So those original CW complexes had obvious cellular chains, so they were quickly recognized as giving A infinity structures in a differential graded category. And so, in fact, later on, people realized that it's possible to consider A infinity structures in any category with a reasonable notion of homotopy and higher homotopy. The rather obvious, except nobody thought of it for 30 years, Fukaya, in his study of Floer homology, introduced A infinity categories. Now they're usually referred to as Fukaya categories. Just as a group can be considered to be a one-object category, leading to the idea of a groupoid as a multi-object category, so an A infinity algebra considered as having one object leads to the idea of an A infinity category. And Fukaya was very generous in pointing out that he was making use of some of my work. So another very important source of A infinity structures, and it was there at the very beginning, is transfer of structures through homotopy equivalences. So suppose A has an algebra structure, an associative product on topological spaces or chain complexes, and suppose it's homoequivalent to something else in the same category with inverse homotopy equivalences. There's no reason C already has an algebraic structure itself, but at least there's a product defined just by going from C cross C into A cross A, back into A by the multiplication, since A has an algebraic structure, and then back to C. Now, is that going to be associative? Not necessarily, but it is at least homotopy associative. In fact, it's fully, see if I can, that's better. It is at least homotopy associative. In fact, fully A infinity, and that A infinity structure is constructed in terms of the chosen homotopy from the composition A of C homotopic to the identity. Now notice that for a chosen homotopy, so an obvious question is how the A infinity structures would be related if we chose a different homotopy. That goes beyond the pay grade for this lecture. So now a different point of view, but closely related by just being a slightly different point of view, considering covering space. We're all familiar with the action of the phenyl-grenyl group on the total space of the covering, and that it's a homomorphism from pi1 to the group of deck transformations. In fact, this is essentially a map from the loop space into the self maps of a typical fiber to itself. But what kind of a map is it? Passing to homotopy classes, it's just a homomorphism. So similarly, more generally, we can ask about a topological group acting on a space. That's a homomorphism from the group into the automorphisms of A, or at least the endomorphisms. So if A is homotopy equivalent to Z, is there a corresponding action of G on Z, or at least something like one? Well, from what's gone before, you probably anticipate the answer. It inherits a homotopy coherent action of G on Z. Not that I've quite defined that yet, but you get the spirit. Now, Sugawara did not treat actions up to higher homotopies as such, though in fact they were hiding there in his group. He did introduce maps of associative H spaces, which were homomorphism up to higher homotopies. He called them strongly homotopy multiplicative maps. And Victor Guggenheim thought that should be abbreviated to the SHMAPs. So anyway, what is a homotopy coherent map of associative H spaces? It's a whole family based on cubes. And Dan Kahn, at my first job at MIT, told me just because you've written something on the blackboard, in those days it was a blackboard, don't assume you've communicated with your audience. So first of all, notice that the conditions are on the faces of the cube. In one case, we're multiplying the elements. And in the other case, we're composing them. So that was the basic idea. Now, these become very important in terms of vibrations and fiber spaces. Quite generally, where that refers to just some sort of homotopy lifting condition. But in the early days, the Hurewicz fibrations, which have the homotopy lifting property for maps of general spaces, are the stimulating example, which led on from there. Now, I don't know why I put this all on one slide, but whoops. So consider a Hurewicz fiber space, where F is the fiber of some base point. One version of the classification of such bundles, fibrations, is by action of the base loop space on the fiber. This began with Hilton. Those of you who haven't read Hilton's introduction to homotopy theory, I highly recommend it. Even 60 years later, it's a gem. So what Hilton showed was that there was an action, it's in quotes because there's no particular higher condition. Sorry. Hilton showed that, in fact, the two ways of composing, let's see if I can't get this more out of the way. That's better. So if you use the associativity of loops, admittedly up to homotopy, you get two different maps from loop cross F, but they are homotopic. By passing to the homotopy classes of base loops, you get a strict action. But of course, a lot of information is lost when you pass to homotopy classes. And indeed, there was more to be discovered. So Suguar did not treat actions up to homotopy as such, but he did introduce strongly homotopy multiplicative maps, as I've mentioned. With John Moore's introduction of an associative space of base loops, the adjoint could be seen as just such a map. Trying to consider the action of a representation of omega B on F, we have perhaps the first example of a homotopy coherent representation, or a representation up to homotopy, though originally it was a representation up to strong homotopy. With the word coherent in there, it's clear you're talking about the higher homotopies, not just the first level. Okay. So, oh, now that's hiding. Can I move that? No, I can't move that. Okay, that would say that this is going, well, it doesn't matter what the title was. Vogt in 1973 gave a fairly elementary explicit description of what later was recognized in terms of a homotopy coherent diagram. For C, a small category, a strict C diagram is just a functor from C into the category where you're drawing the diagram. So a homotopy coherent C diagram in a category D is provided by a homotopy coherent functor, which I'll explain further if you haven't figured it out already for yourself. In 1980, Cordier showed that given a small category, then a homotopy coherent diagram of type A can be described in terms of a homotopy coherent functor, where S of A is a simplicity enriched category generated by A. So what's a simplicity enriched category? In which the space is of morphisms are given the structure of simplicial sets. Composition is given by simplicial maps. So the face and degeneracy options respect the appropriate compositions. These may be referred to as script SE for simplicity enriched, a very important point of view. The other, of course, that we've hinted at earlier is topologically enriched. So a particularly useful tool is the free category on the ordered set. So what does that look like? Well, vertices are non-degenerate edge paths from 0 to n in delta n, in the n simplex. The cases for n equals 0 and n equal 1 give no surprises. But for the one simplex, for the two simplex, there are two non-degenerate paths that lead from 0 to 2 as expressed in the picture. So these form a one simplex with the two different ways as the endpoint. If I had the ability to get in there, I would have put a double arrow going from the composite up and down to the horizontal one, that being the one simplex. So if you go to 3, you now have 4 non-degenerate paths in the standard 3 simplex, which goes from 0 to 3. So it turns out there are 4 vertices and 4 edges. It's a square. And in general, the object is an n-1 cube. So we're going from an m simplex to an n-1 cube, an idea that will occur several places in this area. Another way to think of these relations is in terms of the space of paths, not just edge paths, going from 0 to n as an n-1 cube, as a family of paths with fixed endpoints. One particular way of doing it is to choose them so that, again, we get this structure on the faces of the cube. As before, we eliminate one of the variables, we set one of the variables equal to 0, and of course, this one should be a 1. And there we get the product of the paths involved. Such maps were first produced by Frank Adams in his study of the Kobar construction. That was in the topological context by induction using the contractibility of the n simplex. Later specific formulas were introduced by Chen, and then equivalently, but more transparently, literally, by Agusa. And if time permits after the talk, I can go to where I have a good version of Agusa's picture. Now we shift gears entirely. The idea of a local system. This is what has given a whole new aspect of homotopy coherence. And you'll see in a little while where it has become relevant. Anyway, the idea goes back to 1938. I remember when I was learning the Sayre spectral sequence, adjusting to this idea of a local system gave me a good bit of trouble. The idea is that when you're computing a co-boundary in cohomology, the coefficients depend on where in the space you are. So one way to describe it is in terms of cochains on the universal cover combined with the action of the fundamental group on the universal cover. Steenrod defined it more precisely: cohomology with coefficients in a local system of groups for use when studying fiber bundles. The action on the various fibers of the fundamental groupoid, remember the fundamental groupoid is homotopy classes of paths going from X to Y, not necessarily starting and ending at the same point. So the fundamental groupoid on the base, no, there's a misprint here. The idea is how to show how the cohomology of the total space twists that of the fibers over the base. That is, how the cohomology of the base and fiber are twisted together to represent the total space. This leads to an important link between representation theory and the theory of vector bundles. For a smooth vector bundle with a connection, the path lifting is unique, and you get the classical homotopy, a strict representation of the fundamental group or groupoid on the vector space fiber. This representation, in fact, characterizes the bundle. Once again, there's more going on hidden by passing to homotopy classes in the fundamental groupoid, or rather, the alternative to homotopy classes was to use the connection in order to get a unique lifting. So if you want to go higher, start with a differential graded vector space, which will be the fiber, then define higher holonomy by similarly lifting not a path, but a simplex in the base. Of course, you do it iteratively, starting from a point, and then an interval, and then a two simplex. You get a corresponding map from the M simplex into E. So now let simp M be the simplicial set of maps of simplices into the base. So either the usual singular complex, or if you're trying to do the differential geometry, you want everything to be smooth. Now we can describe an infinity local system on a space X with values in a simplically enriched category to be a map of simplicial sets, which just says that for every simplex, you have an element of the category and boundary operations, et cetera, behave the way you'd like. If C is an ordinary category, then every local system with values in C factors through the quotient homotopy category of simp, which is just the fundamental groupoid. If X is connected and we choose a base point, then we get a representation of the fundamental group, taking us back to the very early days of this subject. On the other hand, we consider the category of chain complexes, and now an infinity local system with values in chain complexes, essentially a homotopy coherent functor. And I guess I never got around to telling you what a coherent homotopy functor was. Well, if you remember way back when I was talking about homotopy coherent morphisms or SHMAPs, well, all I needed was an algebraic structure and a homotopy. So if I can go back, that's exactly what we have here, that the category of chain complexes has the homotopy we need, and the rest of the structure is given simplically. Okay, so why this sudden interest in this ancient topic? 70 years old approximately. Well, Bloch and his student Smith in 2014 re-examined the classical Riemann-Hilbert equivalence as a functor from flat bundles, that is the category of flat vector bundles, to an algebra of representations of pi 1. That's the classical version. Bloch and Smith consider it a generalization to using differential graded bundles, as we've looked at previously, and they invoked representation up to homotopy, what we've just looked at, of simp n acting on E. In other words, what they introduce is an infinity local system on M, which they denote by this configuration of symbols, pi infinity being used for simp up to homotopy. Now, in their result, they switch categories. They're really thinking more in terms of algebraic geometry, so they can pull some fancy tricks over there so that theirs is in fact an equivalence. But an open question is how to realize a strict bundle or even a fibration if you're given an infinity local system. Just the way you can regard an ordinary bundle or fibration for good base spaces as being locally trivial or locally homotopy trivial and pasting things together. It's not yet clear how this would work in this generality. That's something that Tim and I hope to pursue. Anyway, interesting thing happened on the way to the forum. Manuel Rivera and Mahmoud Zainalian used both infinity local systems and the above realization of a simplex as a family of paths parameterized by the cubes to shed new light on Ed Brown's classical result. That the chains on the total space of a fibration are weakly equivalent to a twisted tensor product between chains on the fiber and chains on the base. By weakly equivalent, it means a homotopy equivalence respecting the fibration structure. The twist is in fact given by a homotopy coherent representation of the cobar DG algebra of C star B on the chains on F. Passing to the cobar brings us back to Frank Adams and then Chen and Ngusa to get the higher homotopies necessary for a homotopy coherent representation. And with that, I'll end this twisted tale of homotopy coherence. And as usually, I went too fast, but that leaves plenty of time for questions, which I am eager to hear. So,
fantastic.
Yep, go ahead. It's all yours.
Well, before we get to questions, let's briefly unmute ourselves and applaud for the speaker.
Thank you. Let me get out of here so I can see you when, we got some questions in the chat.
Oh, in the chat, I shared the link from your slides.
Right.
But yeah, so what questions do we have? So please go ahead and unmute yourself to ask.
Oh, those are Forsey's slides, not mine. So that's something I will show you later, but I will make my slides available.
Well, let me start with a question, Jim. So you alluded to that, these are things that you and others had thought about a long time ago, but then there's been more recent interest. So what's your personal story to start thinking about these more again? Was it that 2014 paper that you mentioned when you came across that, or?
That certainly sparked my interest. Bloch and his student were actually my colleagues at Penn, where I'm a permanent visitor. But there wasn't much communication. So as I said, a lot of their language is from algebraic geometry, which I don't speak fluently. So that was one thing. But oh no, the other major interest is the fact that this stuff is showing up in mathematical physics. There are things called gauge transformations, fields being sections of bundles. So a whole machinery of differential forms, therefore of homotopies, is very prominent in that whole area. That would take a whole nother lecture, so I didn't even want to mention it. But yes, actually before Bloch and Smith sidetracked me in the direction I took today, a lot of my recent work had been on the homotopy theory occurring in physics, so-called cohomological physics. I first used the phrase cohomological physics, and somebody disagreed. Oh, come on, that's not a subject in itself. Well, as so often, I was perhaps premature, but the topic has certainly proceeded. Oh, by the way, the original work on A-infinity structures was turned down by a certain journal, not to be named, as being totally self-contained and of no relevance to any other part of mathematics, much less to mathematical physics. So some other questions, please.
Okay, this is Christina Cooperberg. I don't have any questions. I just wanted to say hello, Jim.
Hi, good to meet you. I've met your son, but I've never met you.
I think we met at some JMM meeting
a
long time ago.
Long time ago, yes. Good.
I wanted to ask, oh, go ahead.
Dziękuję, Katrina.
O, proszę. Proszę bardzo.
So Jim, I want to ask about associahedra. So when you first started thinking about them, you didn't know that they could be realized as sort of polytopes in Euclidean space, but it was the cell structure that you needed, and
the cell structure was all I needed with a particular parameterization. Let me see if I can bring up a picture. There.
You got
Everybody
it.
See that now?
Yep.
Right. So that's the original associahedron, convex, but not in the strict sense, and certainly not a polytope. A couple of the faces are curves. This one could have been straight, but anyway, if you count vertices, this is a pentagon, this is a square, this is a pentagon, etc. And I have to go back above. Anyway, there are a lot of very nice pictures. Now I have to get out of screen sharing in order to find something else, I think. I'll stop the share. I'll show you more later if anybody's interested. Meanwhile, other questions?
There's a question in the chat from David. So what is the relation between an H space and a general topological space? So roughly speaking, what's the extra structure?
An H space, H apparently in honor of Hopf, an H space is a topological space with a product that is, we'll call the H space X. So you have a map of X cross X into X. So two variables go to one. There's no other requirement except for a base point, which acts as the identity. So that an H space is a topological space with this twofold product, this binary product, and one minor condition. Good enough, David?
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you for the question.
All right, further questions?
"20 people, wow, come on, there must be some more questions."
This, can you hear me?
Yes, just fine.
Okay, great. This construction with the simplicial complex you mentioned earlier, was that related to this homotopy coherent nerve, or was that something else?
Oh yes, there was a whole other section I decided to leave out. The homotopy coherent nerve is a very important part. Again, if I could just bring it up easily, I would. Let's give it a try. Okay, now I am or I am not sharing my screen right now.
Not currently.
Not sharing.
No.
Right. So let me find it first. Okay, now if I share my screen, there's the button. Everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay, so first of all, as you see, there are a lot of other things in here. And somewhere in here, there should be nerves.
Yeah, it's section 6.
Right, page 18. So there's a whole story here, which will be in the paper. It's a little complicated. That's why I decided it would take me down a rabbit hole. There's one comment which is perhaps useful. First of all, that there's a good background in defining a differential graded nerve, which turns out to be a quasi-category, which means that the identities for a category are defined up to equivalence. So an A infinity category on the standard simplex turns out to be very useful. Again, the formulas are not critical, but, and this is one reason why I didn't put this up, the definition is very clear if you understand all the notation. So those of you who are interested, there's an earlier paper which should be listed here. Part of the point was that this is based in part on our earlier work. Probably easiest to go here. Oh, come on. Okay, Porter. Okay, a lot of this is an extension of work on homotopy coherent representations, and the bibliographic data is there. As you see, it just appeared this year. Also, the paper we're looking at here, this one, as you can see, is work in progress, though it's due today. Fortunately, the editor, I think, is compassionate, so hopefully by next week we can get into that. Rather than babble myself, I would love to have more questions. Oh, let me show you some more pictures first while I've got the screen sharing on.
Yeah, I'll never complain about more pictures.
Right, exactly. And there are plenty to go with this. So let's go to 4C. Well, if you start looking at strongly homotopy multiplicative maps of A infinity spaces, you get, hopefully the pictures here, something called the multiplohedron. So here's an alternate picture of K5, which is clearly a polytope. Come on. Okay, so here's the multiplohedron. If it's not too tiny to read, there are the two ways of associating, which are related by an interval. Then you have an interval for going from the product, the image of the product to the product of the images. And it turns out there are 6 ways to put those together. And you get a hexagon, and then corresponding thing for more variables. It's a little hard to see that entirely. Some of his 3-dimensional representations in the strong sense are probably better. Let's see if I could. Okay, so I was just mentioning the multiplohedron, which originally arose from morphisms up to homotopy of A infinity spaces. And if you want to see what something like, you can rotate it. Now, the whole point of Stefan's collection is to give the combinatorial data, as you'll notice over here, number of facets, for example, so that some of the sequences can be realized as very classical. I guess that's all. Okay. Back at the, there we go. So there's one version of the multiplohedron, then there's something called a brick polytope, pterahedron, permutahedron. Permutahedron is easy to describe. It's just you take endpoints in Rn+1, I guess, and which are not no 3 or collinear. And then you, well, in fact, just take the points with coordinates 0, 1, 2, etc. up to n. Then permute those coordinates and you will see the vertices of this figure. And you notice there's a tremendous bibliography, depending upon your own persuasion, combinatorics, numerical, F vectors, H vectors, for those of you who speak that language. I don't. Let's see what a different kind of permutahedron. There are lots of things based on graphs. The ordinary associahedron can be generalized in terms of a Coxeter classification. So you get a type B. This one happens to be also the Bermuda associahedron. In the Bermudahedron, the vertices are as I described, and the edges, for example, correspond to an interchange. But think of the string as think of the various n tuples as giving a point in Rm plus 1. And so there's no associativity involved. That's all I was trying to say. Whereas in the permuta associahedron, you have both associativity and permutations. And I'm surprised he doesn't mention Kapranov. I believe Kapranov was the first to have the permuta associahedron, unless this is subtly different. So I'll have to check with him. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Then we get cyclic polytopes. And you can see it's incredibly thorough. Though he keeps adding to it, by the way. Traveling salesman polytope. I haven't been through all of this myself. So let me see if I can find cyclohedron. There we go. There's a cyclohedron, usually denoted with a W. Where it first occurred was in the Bott-Taub's paper.
Oh, wow.
They didn't call it a cyclohedron. I happened to be at MSRI when I think it was Bott was giving the talk. And it sounded, like something I was familiar with. So I tracked it down further and realized that indeed it was a cyclic version of the associahedron. Notice some of the people involved. Oh, Davidos, by the way, is another master at creating such pictures. He even had a three-dimensional associahedron, the three-dimensional version, but the faces were actually, this was physical, more than physical. He made a model which he took to the, what is called, the Burning Man Festival, and it was animated so that the pentagonal faces could be opened out. Anyway, it goes on and on from there.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing this encyclopedia. Maybe we have time for, if there's one more short question that anyone would like to ask.
Too much time for this, by all means. Oh, surely there's another question. But feel free to contact me. Let me stop sharing. There we go. Well, we have it. We've lost a few people, but not too many.
Let's end here. So thanks so much, Jim. We really appreciate it. And please do reach out if you have more questions. And thanks so much, everybody.
Well, thank you for attending. And by all means, do contact me if you want to know any more, or keep your eyes open for the posted version of the latest with Tim Porter. Take care.
Will do.
Bye-bye.